A manhunt for a terror suspect, rejoining the EU science programme, and many children still missing school. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Catherine Fletcher, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Kehinde Andrews, Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, and Albie Amankona from GB News. Today, how did a terror suspect escape from a South London prison?
The Justice Secretary has initiated already an internal inquiry into the specific circumstances around this particular individual and this case. But the most important thing now is for anyone, if they have any information at all that they think is relevant, to please contact the police.
There should be an independent inquiry into exactly what has gone wrong. I think we now know there were already some pretty damning reports into Wandsworth.
We now have this fantastic deal that's a good deal for scientists, for researchers, for businesses, and of course for the taxpayer.
The UK is rejoining the EU science programme. Has Rishi Sunak reset relations after Brexit? My guest, Professor Kehinde Andrews, has a new book about racism and what he calls white psychosis. I'll ask what he means.
Do you ever want to go out on the playground?
Because I don't want to get something wrong and people laughing.
And why are so many children struggling to attend school? A head teacher will join us live. Let's start with the terror suspect who has escaped jail. As we said, a manhunt is underway. The headlines, Daily Telegraph, terror suspect escapes jail under lorry. And this is the front page of The Sun. Jail security scandal, total farce, it says there, under a picture of the suspect. Let's get the latest on what's happening. We're joined by Mark Lebel, the BBC's reporter outside Wandsworth Prison. What do we know so far, Mark?
Well, Joe, it's a very embarrassing prison escape, as those front pages show, and there are two aspects to this that are moving very fast, the manhunt and the fallout from it. In terms of the manhunt, well, we know what we're beginning to get more details of what happened behind me yesterday morning. The Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, just saying that at 7:30 yesterday morning, the food delivery van left the kitchen area and drove away out of the prison here, and police were alerted, and in their subsequent searching of the vehicle, found strapping underneath. Once the prison guards realised that the 21-year-old was missing, the former serving British Army officer, and now somebody still facing trial on the 13th of November for a series of accusations, planting fake bombs and, of course, collecting information useful for enemies. He's on the run. All the police forces in the country have been informed and have been asked to help, as have all the border points as well, so he can't leave the country. As far as the Met is telling us, the last update was 3:30 yesterday, and they're sticking with the line that they've had no sightings that they're telling us about of the suspect, and that they probably think he still remains in the London area. So that's the latest on that investigation. But there has been a huge political fallout from this. The Justice Secretary has announced two investigations, one into how it was the prisoner was actually able to escape when there should be, of course, rigorous checks on the way out, and secondly, why he was in a Category B prison when there are higher security prisons available. This was a terror suspect, deemed probably a flight risk, hence why he wasn't given bail. Separately, we've had the Prison Officers Association saying that they want an urgent review of the running of prisoners. They said there can't be cuts, budget cuts, without consequences, but they're waiting to find out exactly what happened from an internal review as well. And Labour, of course, have used the opportunity to point the finger at the government too.
Mark Lebel there outside Wandsworth Prison. Thank you very much for bringing us right up to date. How much pressure is the government under over this, Catherine?
So actually, I just saw the Lord Chancellor's statement in the House before I came to you today. I think he's very clear. He's kind of got the ministerial team to make sure he worked with the Met. As your reporters just said, he's got an immediate investigation into the categorisation of the prisoners in Wandsworth as well, and then also in the broader estate. the circumstances of how it's about to happen, shift patterns, who was doing what, was the right procedures followed. But also to make sure that the scrutiny's right. He's also, in the House, talked about there being an independent, investigation into this as well, to make sure that it's not marking its own homework, and I think that's correct.
Right. I mean, we already know, actually, from the Labour MP who represents the area where the prison is based, because she had already raised concerns with the Justice Secretary about unsafe staffing levels. And yes, there's an investigation into the level of security. Could this have been prevented if there had been proper staffing levels?
I'm not going to speculate. I think the Prime Minister's right to say, let's make sure that if anyone's got any information at all, give it to the Metropolitan Police. But it's also important to remember these are really rare events. I mean, it's, less than 10 prisoners have escaped. It's 5. I don't want to give you the wrong information, but in the last 10 years...
No, they are very rare. In fact, I think it's been decades since a terror suspect to say.
And actually, to be fair, the prison officers do a great job. There's 2 prisons in the South Ribble constituency, Garth and Weimar, and, many of the people that work there are my constituents. And, they do a great job. They care about their prisoners. They understand they're there to pay a debt to society, but they want to look after them. So I don't think we should, I think we should celebrate the job that the prison services does as well.
Right. Well, talking about the job, is it right to blame the government for this?
I think we might want to say that these are rare events. The question is whether the conditions in which they can happen are going to get more frequent. And the challenge here is that Wandsworth is a prison, I believe it was due to take 950 prisoners, and at the moment it's got 1,600 in it. So understandably so, our prison officers, I agree with you, they do a fantastic job, but we're asking them to do it in impossible conditions with an estate that is not fit for purpose. And I think it's just the story that's coming back time and time again, which is the austerity that this government has put forward is a false economy, and it is creating and cutting corners in all sorts of places, and the consequences are arising. I agree with you. We need an independent inquiry because I think we have to be honest about what has happened.
Right, yeah.
But I don't think you can avoid the fact that Wandsworth was not a good place to start with to send somebody of that category and that concern. And I think obviously we desperately want to help the police in finding this person. But if you're asking people to operate in that environment, it's not hard to see why it's hard to keep literal eyes on all the prisoners. Would
you accept that? And austerity has had a part to play?
I think there's a certain element of speculation as to what's gone on. I don't know what's gone on. I know you don't either. Let's understand.
We do know those factual numbers, Catherine. We do know that prison was almost double its capacity. That's got to have an impact on its operational capacity.
But what we don't know is we do not know what's happened. We know that a prisoner's absconded and we're trying to find him, and that's all that's known at this stage. And I've got a biology degree, so I'm Mrs. Fact. So let's deal with the facts and let's address the facts.
That is a fact. We also know that there have been report after report raising concerns about Wandsworth. I mean, if you want to look at the evidence prior to this, we knew there was a problem with the prison estate. As you say, local MPs have been raising concerns. The question is how much that has contributed to the capacity for this gentleman to abscond.
Very briefly, are we?
It should be a basic principle that a prison should be able to keep prisoners inside the prison quarters. And in fact, this man escaped underneath a van, and in the airlock within prisons, those vans are supposed to be checked with mirrors. There's a dome above the vans where people can check. So obviously that job was not done properly, because that is how a prisoner escaped. And are you seriously saying that all of the cuts are stopping people from getting mirrors to look underneath vans?
I'm saying if you've got double the number of people that you're trying to manage, inevitably it's going to impact on your capacity to do the job. And that's what we need to look at. But I hope you can accept, Albie, if it is double the capacity it should be, that is going to have consequences.
Kayinde?
Well, yeah, I think you can't ignore what austerity has done. It's not just the prisons, it's the schools, it's the hospitals. The whole estate is falling apart. And you'd be completely ignorant to say it hasn't had an impact on how high security prisoners are disappearing.
If we get any more developments on this story, we'll bring them to you as soon as possible. Let's talk about Britain rejoining. We can see here in the Telegraph headline, Britain to rejoin EU scientific research programme Horizon with discounted membership. This is how it's covered in The Independent. Sunak clears up another Boris Brexit mess as UK rejoins EU's Horizon scheme. This has been going on for some time. It's a collaboration, Horizon, involving Europe's leading research institutes and technology companies, and researchers and institutes can apply for an £81 billion fund, or at least part of it, and UK scientists will be able to do that again. Stella, as chair of the Labour Movement for Europe, you must welcome this.
Oh, we've been calling for the government to sort out, because obviously we wanted to be part of Horizon. I think the challenge here is the deal that's being done. If I understand correctly, and Catherine may know better than I do because she's on the Science Committee, that it doesn't include Euratom, which is the atomic energy programme.
But that's a good thing, but I'll explain why it is a good thing.
Well, I'm surprised to hear that, because the Minister came to your committee a year ago, George Freeman, and said that of all the schemes like Euratom and Copernicus, it was Euratom that was the hardest to replicate, and so the one he wanted most to be part of.
No. So there's a teeny bit of a misapprehension there. So, first of all, this is brilliant news. Like, the Science and Tech Select Committee are all cock-a-hoop about this.
It's taken time, though, hasn't it,
Yeah,
Catherine?
well, it's a recognition of how the UK can contribute to collaborative research, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector. On the point that Stella makes about the Euratom, it's about fusion. So for the uninitiated,
yes, keep it brief for the because I want to keep it a broader discussion about whether this is a good or bad.
It's genuinely interesting. So conventional nuclear takes big things and breaks them apart and takes energy. Fusion takes small things and puts them together.
Broadly, why aren't we part of
that industry? Didn't want to be part of
That's
Euratom.
not the case. I'm sorry,
So
that's
I went
not the
to
case.
Oxfordshire with the Science and Technology Select Committee. You know, colleagues Graham Stringer amongst them, and they sat us down and said, we've come out of the UK nuclear regulator, and we really would like to consider just because it says nuclear fusion, and they've got a £650 billion carve out from the UK government.
I'm going to listen. You're down. Hang on, Stella. You're down in the nitty-gritty. I don't want to lose the audience on this story more broadly. What does it say about Rishi Sunak? Has he been able to reset relations? It's taken months and months and months. UK scientists have lost out on being able to apply for that large amount of money or part of it. What does it say about the Prime Minister?
It says brilliant things about the Prime Minister. This is good news.
Great.
Cheer
This is
up,
great.
Stella. This is a good thing for British science, British medicine and British pharmaceuticals. Big companies like Graphcore, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, ARM have been calling for Britain to rejoin the Horizon scheme. That's exactly what Rishi Sunak has been able to do as a result of the Windsor framework. This is a win for the UK. I wish Labour was happy about it.
Right, hang on, let me get Kayinde and then I'll come to you.
Because this is the problem. It's only news because we left Europe. Like, we just fixed something that shouldn't have happened in the first place.
I'm sorry, not.
Hang on, let him finish.
As somebody who works in universities, this is billions of pounds in universities, and it's a perfect example of the EU more broadly. We put in money, but we get more out. And actually, the uncertainty that has come, not just from this, but the way the government has generally treated universities, has led to things like the strikes that we're seeing because of all the financial uncertainty. And this was very simple. Had we not damaged ourselves by leaving the EU and leaving the programme in the first place, we wouldn't have to row back. So I can't really celebrate.
No, but you welcome the fact that the UK is now an associate member.
It's exactly. Haven't even got the same rights we had before. So it's not. For me, this is not good news. This is just news, something not fixing a problem properly that you caused in the first place.
It's better because we've got guarantees that we can go over the investment that we put in should the bids be successful, which is a performance incentive, and we've got what the industry wants in terms of the fusion carve out, and we've got a huge vote of confidence in innovation that grows the economy. This is a brilliant thing.
I mean, I've heard different things from the industry who are facing higher costs because we're now going to try and go it alone on fusion. But who was wrong?
This is not the thing to be miserable about.
On the 2nd of February last year, the Science Minister himself came before your committee and said, out of all the different parts of the deal of
the
Horizon,
Science Minister has been on my phone all morning.
I listened to you. I read his transcript. He talked about Euratom being the one he most wanted.
All right, I don't want to go back to Euratom, but more broadly, you do welcome it, and you think that this is a good thing for UK.
It's the only reason that we weren't part of Horizon was because we behaved so badly over the Northern Ireland Protocol that the Europeans said, well, hang on a minute, if you won't keep your word on one thing, we're not sure you can keep your word on another thing.
Do you accept that?
This isn't celebrating, this is acknowledging responsibility.
Hang on, do you not accept that? Well, is that the case?
I think they were behaving unreasonably. If you look at the checks on the Northern Ireland border, I think 20% of checks on all external EU borders were happening on that UK Northern Ireland border, and it makes up less than 5% of EU external borders. That was an unfair way to treat the United Kingdom. So it was not just the UK.
This is the government
working in a bad way.
This is them acknowledging they made a problem, and you don't get praise. I'm sorry, you don't get praise. You don't get praise.
That's my point.
Well, on that, hang on, don't all talk over each other because people can't hear and you've all got interesting things to say. But, Catherine, do you accept that point that having made that decision legitimately to leave the EU, that, the European Union didn't have to do us any favours?
The government didn't make a problem. The government implemented a democratic will, and I say that as someone that was on the other side.
But with the
of
Northern Ireland
debate.
Protocol, I'm talking about the trading arrangements with Northern Ireland.
I honestly think this is a day to be positive. So what's happened is we've collaborated with our friends in Europe over Ukraine. We've established a basis of trust there. We've now got a Prime Minister that's got a great relationship, that's investing for mutual
a great
beneficial
relationship.
with
That
our
might be
friends.
overstating it, I suppose.
In science, this is mutually beneficial for innovation and growth in the future and some of the biggest, most difficult medical and technical challenges. We get to work together. There's a wall-to-wall of the leads of universities that say this is brilliant.
Is this sour grapes by you?
No. This is all examples of the problems that Brexit has created that now need urgent resolution, because actually being part of Horizon was part of the deal, but because subsequently we behaved so badly, the Europeans, I think understandably, felt we couldn't be trusted. And all that Rishi Sunak is doing at the moment is trying to crawl back from having a predecessor who couldn't decide whether the French were our friend or foe.
This is not a crawl back. This is an investment in a great technology.
Is it?
You can shout over people, but the reality is, A, the science ministers wanted something different, and B, this government created this mess, and British investment, British researchers, already a lot of the research and science has started to move overseas anyway because of the delays.
You are talking this country down.
Exactly.
Don't do it.
That is outrageous.
No, I'm standing up for the scientists and the researchers who've been tearing their hair out about.
All right, well, hang on. On that,
that,
you think it's the same? You think it's a, what did you call it, a crawl back?
Of course, I've worked in universities and there's been panic for the last couple of years. And this is a problem which was created. It could have been solved ages ago. It's taken far too long. This is better than nothing. But I'm sorry, you just don't get praise for having to reverse something which you made. Isn't it?
Well, is this the start of some collaboration on other sectors? Because that's what the Labour Party would like to see.
British business desperately needs it. So in the Labour Movement for Europe, we're really keen on something called the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention, because of the amount of red tape that British businesses are now facing in their supply chain. So the next test for people like you, Catherine, is, OK, you want to see better cooperation. What about joining the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention and helping British businesses who face reams of paperwork like that just to export a single item? It is killing British business to have all these problems.
Catherine?
I think you are dangerously close to refighting a debate that's comprehensively over.
Rejoining the single market?
Just so I'm clear, then, you don't want to deal with the paperwork.
Do you want to rejoin the EU?
No, I've said very clearly I don't think that's in the interests of the British people right now to have that conversation.
Is it in your interests?
No, because actually what I see is British businesses don't have the time. So many of them are struggling with the consequences of Brexit. They need urgent answers now. So things like the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention are things that you could do now. I'm very clear about this. Is not about rejoin. And all the time that people try to avoid that conversation, British businesses are looking at their bottom line, looking at the cost of supply chains, all the extra inflation, and wondering if it is worth keeping going. They deserve better.
Catherine?
So our friends and partners in Europe will be important trading partners, but the truth is the growth is around the world, which is why you've got free trade. You've got the snappily titled CPTPP. We're talking to
let's not do acronyms.
You can fight many things, Catherine, but you can't fight geography.
Well, we're going to
our biggest trading nations on our doorstep.
We're no doubt going to refight and continue to do so this issue around Brexit and consequences. Let me just bring you this breaking news. It broke earlier this morning. That's the MP Chris Pincher quits after losing groping appeal. He was the former chief whip under Boris Johnson, resigned as an MP after losing his appeal against his suspension from the House of Commons over groping allegations. A by-election in his former seat of Tamworth will be expected maybe the same date as the Mid-Bedfordshire seat vacated by the former Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries, October the 19th. There's also a by-election in Rutherglen and Hamilton in Scotland on October the 5th. It will be a busy month with party conferences. Let's talk about something different. The Guardian. Children with mild anxiety better off in school, says Chris Whitty. The Chief Medical Officer for England has said long periods of absence can make students' anxiety worse. Just to give you an idea of some of the figures, the official figure for the last academic year shows 22% of pupils in England were persistently absent. It was around 1 in 10 before the pandemic. BBC Two has produced a documentary on pupils who are struggling with attendance in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. Let's just have a look at a clip from the film.
Scott's joined us from primary school and at the moment he's highly anxious. So what we're doing is we're trying to work with him to up his attendance because at the first week of school he just wasn't coming in at all. So he's doing 10 till 1 because he obviously doesn't want to go through all the crowds.
Do you ever want to go out on the playground? Why don't you want to go on the playground?
Don't like it.
What don't you like about it?
Too many kids. We've got 200 and something.
Do you like being out here?
Yeah, 'cause it's chill. You can hardly hear anyone screaming or whatever. And it's just calm.
When you get scared of the crowd, how does it feel in your body?
No, pounding. Pounding.
And what do you want to do when it's pounding?
Go into a room with hardly anyone in. 'Cause I don't want to get something wrong and people laughing there.
Now, it's worth mentioning that Scott, that you've just seen there in Helping Our Teens documentary, has made some progress and is attending some classes since that film was made. Let's talk to Sukhjot Dami, who is the principal at Beacon Hill Academy in Birmingham, where the documentary was filmed. Welcome to you. How big a problem is absence in your school?
I think in line with the national picture, attendance has significantly dropped since COVID, and it is a big issue. Luckily for us, it is on the way back up, but it's still significantly higher than what we would like it to be.
What's the cause, do you think? What was it about the pandemic that has caused so many children to stay off school?
Well, the biggest issue for us is really the number of learners that we've now got that have got social, emotional and mental health issues, anxiety, and I guess a lot of that was down to lockdown and not being able to socialise and then getting back into the routine of things. So, at the moment we've got 88 students out of a cohort of over 1,000 students that have got some form of, anxiety issues, also some emotional and mental health issues. And as a result of that, we are now having to cater for, these additional needs to get learners back into school and keep them in there.
What is your approach, I should say, to pupils who don't come to school routinely?
Well, I think, given the circumstances that we're in and given the COVID period, we have to use both a carrot and stick approach. Now, at Beacon Hill Academy, we've developed what we're calling a student support centre, where learners can come in if, they haven't been into school for months or weeks because of their anxiety, so that they're not going directly into the classroom. And then that student support centre has become a bridge to moving them from there into the classroom, and it's that very slow transition back. And the video that you saw there earlier was of Scott, who is one of those students that didn't go to school at primary school. He came to Beacon Hill after the COVID pandemic and was really struggling with school life. So we've had to create additional areas of the school and fund them to be able to really help our students re-engage back into school life.
What about parents' responsibility? How much store do you set that parents should be, I suppose many viewers will think, make their children go to school?
Yeah, parents play a big responsibility in this. It's a partnership between the school, the local authorities, the parents, but absolutely, parents need to, realise that just taking one day off every fortnight is actually having a significant impact on our learners' education. I think what we're beginning to see more of as well is that parents are working from home, so they're more inclined to keep their child at home if they're at home, and they think that they can catch up on that work. So actually, we're finding that there's numerous different reasons for why learners are not going back into school. But as I've said, the trend is back up, but there's still more work to be done.
Well, that's encouraging. Sukhjot Dami, stay with us, because we've got two politicians here. And in fact, actually, before I go to them, what would you ask them to do?
Well, I think the key thing really is, it's not just about the school. We've got to work more collaboratively. We've got to work in partnership. That's the local authority, that's the parents at the school. Sometimes feel that it all comes back down to the school, and I remember the Secretary of State saying, well, the head teachers need to drive around and pick them up. Well, we've been doing that for years. We've got a minibus that goes out and picks up our learners. We have breakfast every morning. We have transition meetings. We have attendance clinics. But actually, what we now need is more support from central government.
Right. Well, before I actually get them to respond, Kehinde, you wanted to say something.
Well, I just think this focus on attendance is you criminalise non-attendance. There's always this. I have lots of kids in school, and it's always attendance. Misses the point that actually just getting kids into school doesn't solve the problem. Schools are often hostile.
Is that not where you need to start?
Well, no, you have to start with the school. Why are kids not going into school? Why do we assume that being in school is positive? In fact, the data I see tells you that more black children are in school, the worse it is for them. And actually, so we should be saying we need to fix what's wrong with.
Are you saying that black children shouldn't go to school?
Look, I have 4 black kids, and I'm just trying to tell you that the evidence is very clear. Attendance, you get them into the schools are hostile environments. So it's a bigger problem about what's happening in the school, not just can we get them into school, force them into school.
What do you say to the idea that schools are hostile environments, as Kehinde is saying, to black pupils?
I don't recognise that at all. You know, Beacon Hill Academy is a very nurturing environment, and the documentary you will see tonight shows that. And you know, one of the learners that is featured in the documentary is a black student that has been previously excluded from 2 other schools. And you know, you will see the relationships that we develop with those individual learners, and as a result, are able to educate our learners in the way that they should be.
I mean, I'm going to ask Catherine and Stella. I mean, more than a fifth we're talking about routinely missing school. Is the government really taking this seriously enough?
So can I just say, one of my best mates in Parliament is Marco Longhi, who I know was with you and your team during results this summer, and he could not sing your praises more highly. He's talking about outstanding students and outstanding school. And I know he's working with you on other stuff that helps you carry on. But he's asked me to ask you to say thank you for everything that you do. So there you go. He owes me a pint now. And I'll buy you one if you're in the same bar.
Oh, right. Well, let's all go to the pub.
But it's a very serious issue.
Yes.
And getting, I have to disagree fundamentally. Children need to go to school to build those life experiences, to get an education that unlocks lots of opportunities for them. And the multi-agency working, which is, the school shouldn't be on its own. It should be supported by a community and a family structure. And that's, the government guidance is calling for that.
But is the government taking this issue broadly seriously enough?
Honestly,
I mean, in terms of being absent from school, if you agree, as Sokjut says, that kids have to be in school every single day, it has to be a sort of mandatory thing that schools, government, parents, society are responsible for.
Yeah, because it's not prison; it's an investment in them and their future. That's what's important to remember. I do worry. The pandemic will have a lot of long tail effects. And some children have got lots of anxiety coming off the back of it. But I cannot wait to watch the documentary to see what practical measures you and your teams are putting in place to maybe others can learn from best practice.
The only thing, Stella, is some children learnt quite well from home during the pandemic. There are some pupils who do learn perhaps better some of the time at home, and they've got used to it as a result of the pandemic. It's going to be very difficult to change and sort that.
So I feel very strongly about this because I had the privilege growing up. My mother was a head teacher of a special school. She worked very closely with children who had emotional behavioural difficulties. She continued to work in mainstream schools. About how you do some of the work I think this documentary is about. That work needs to be resourced. I am desperately concerned by the numbers of children in this country who are in what is called alternative provision, which isn't really provision at all. Much of it is unregulated, and we are writing off an entire generation. You have to look at the figures about the children affected by that, particularly children with special educational needs, particularly children from black heritage environments.
So what needs to be done?
And it's asking about, well, I suspect what this video shows you is that having that extra support in schools is absolutely critical to helping to understand why children find it a hostile environment or why children are struggling. And that's the challenge. Every single school in my community tells me they are dying out for mental health support. They have children with big anxiety problems, big social and emotional difficulties, and the teachers do not have the capacity to deal with that. So I think when we watch this video, absolutely, it sounds like you are a head teacher investing in, but every head teacher needs the resources to be able to do that work. And yes, we do need to address, because I've also dealt with some of the issues around adultification in schools, we do need to address concerns about why parents don't have that relationship with schools to be able to tackle these things. It takes investment, and my worry is especially special education needs provision. Those schools have gone Alternative provision is just a kind of holdings pen for people. We've written off a whole generation of children, and now we're seeing the consequences of it.
It's interesting, the carrot and stick approach, the balance that Sokjuk was talking about, and the responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to get children into schools who have been routinely at home?
Parents' responsibility. Look, I'm from a West African family. The idea that if I didn't want to go to school, my West African family would have said, "Oh, it's all right, darling, just stay at home," is absolutely ridiculous. School, in my community, in my culture, is so important. Parents will withhold themselves from proper food and things like that to send their children to private schools. They will make sacrifices because education is important to West African families. And that is why I think this whole idea that, oh, you know, it's just that kids are feeling a little bit more anxious and we've got to give them more support in schools. Yes, that might be true, but we've also got to give the parents a kick in the posterior to say, you need to get your children to school. This is your responsibility. It's a partnership between school and parents, and the parents have got to play that part.
Albie, that might sound great on GB News, but the actual reality of dealing with families, especially families who are probably working 2 or 3 jobs, and how you work with them. Like, you can have all the rhetoric you want. The reality on the ground. Well, you've just, it's just about telling the parents to do better. The parents in my community are trying really hard for their kids. They're facing a number of barriers. And we can either have this rhetoric at the top and ignore it, or we can watch films like this and think, how can we get more of those people to work?
So you don't think it's the parents' responsibility?
I think it's everyone's responsibility, Albie, and I just think it doesn't help to write people off.
Everybody thinks education is important. But guess what? Black Caribbean families also think education is important. But education and schooling are 2 different things. And there are many schools which are not environments I would want to send my child into. And I'm not surprised that kids don't go. It sounds like it's an excellent school. I don't want to say it's no good practice, but to ignore the fact that the schools are doing harm in many cases to children and just warehousing them in there like a prison is not doing anybody justice.
Let's go back to Sokjuk finally. Listening to what you've heard, a range of views around the table here in the studio. Let's go back briefly to that issue of parental responsibility. What is your view, and actually on children's resilience themselves?
Look, I think I've heard what the panel is saying, and actually, in many ways, I agree with all of them. There is no one single solution. You know, absolutely, it is the parents' responsibility, but we also need to think of some other factors. Schools need further support. You know, CAMHS are underfunded. We can't get a referral into CAMHS. We haven't got enough educational psychologists that need the support for our young people.
And those are the school's mental health services, CAMHS, just so people realise what you're talking about.
Sorry, yes. Of course, so we're used to the acronyms.
I know.
So it's you know that there is no one single solution. It's all of those things, and we've got to start working more in partnership. And then yes, of course, you know, parents need to be fined if they are deliberately keeping young people off school. You know, school is so vital and important for our young people, and parents do ultimately carry the responsibility.
Sokjuk Dami, thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk about Kehindé's book. It's entitled The Psychosis of Whiteness. Now, you will appreciate that is a pretty provocative, maybe damning, maybe offensive title. What do you mean exactly?
Well, the point is we need to have a different conversation about race, and a conversation which is uncomfortable. So the reason I use psychosis, and I do use this to trouble the discussion, is one, because we are disproportionately more likely as black people, particularly black Caribbean people, to be diagnosed with psychosis, which is a label which gets put onto us. And actually the argument I'm making is that the reason this happens is because the world we have to inhabit, the discussions, whiteness is a kind of set of ideas. It is so deluded and irrational that it is like talking, it is nothing more, it's like a psychosis. And so we actually suffer mental health because we have to deal with a crazy world.
Give us an example.
Well, for example, I come on TV all the time and have discussions about, is Britain racist? So that's a conversation. I'm sitting here being somebody telling me that West Africans love education, as though black Caribbean people don't like education.
That was your inference, not mine.
It was certainly not my inference at all. I hear this stuff all the time.
How did you get to it then?
If you're in the workplace, there's many stories here in the workplace of having to go through, I mean, I've had personal experiences where you just, you can't believe sometimes how bad it is. And so if you talk to anybody who works in these white institutions, they will tell you that having to tiptoe around and having to I have to watch how I am all the time in work, because just in case I get seen to be the large, black, aggressive man. There's so many ways we have to go through this world because of what I call the psychosis of whiteness. It actually does impact our mental health quite significantly.
Albie, what's your response to that title particularly? Because some people would find it striking and strident.
Or they might find it racist, indeed. I would go as far as saying that. I wonder how Kehinde would feel if Joe or Stella or Catherine were to write a book called The Psychosis of Blackness. I'm sure that Kehinde would call it racist, would you?
This is a perfect example of
But would you or not?
Throwing in a different word, it doesn't make it equivalent. It's ridiculous. So if someone was writing a book, you know, and actually as an
academic... If Joe wrote a book called The Psychosis of Blackness,
if Joe wrote a
you
book
wouldn't
called
think
Psychosis of Blackness, I'd say, what's it about? And then we'd have a discussion.
Come on,
and if you honestly
would be calling it racist from the rooftops.
If you honestly think that the argument I just laid out, that the discussions that we have to go through, that the way that we move through the world...
We weren't talking about the title.
No, but this is the argument, right? That actually, and having to sit here now, and the response to this is, well, just put blackness in the title. What kind of an argument is that? It's not an argument. The point why I've done this and had this is to say, well, actually, we can't have a serious conversation about race. This idea is it's got lots. It's academic. It's got lots of references. I'm a professor, and then the response you get back is, well, put blackness in the title. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. It's not a sensible discussion.
By picking this title, I'm sure, and I read the blurb of the book. I've not read it yet. I will. The blurb of the book actually looks like there's some really interesting and important content there. But because of the title you have put on the book, you are already putting off the majority of the British population who are white. Many white people might look at this book, The Psychosis of Whiteness, and think, this is a racist book. This man thinks white people have psychosis.
Well, as I've never said that, it would be an odd thing to pick up, but that's part of the argument.
What do you mean they're delusional about?
So my argument is not about white people, so it's about whiteness, the ways that we understand it. And there's many examples in here of black people having the psychosis of using the psychosis of whiteness. It's about saying how we understand the world. And importantly, we live in a world where the poorest parts of the world today are where black people live, so-called sub-Saharan Africa. The richest parts are where white people live. There is a hierarchy of white supremacy. And I still have to sit here and tell you that racism actually impacts the world today. 40% of young black men in this country are unemployed. Like, I can give you all these statistics about race, but somehow we don't understand them and interpret them. Because you can't have a proper conversation about race. It's deluded. It's totally and utterly deluded.
Look, I founded an organisation called Conservatives Against Racism about 2 years ago. I'm very passionate about racism. I'm very passionate about finding a solution to the racial disparities that we see. So is this government. There's the Inclusive Britain strategy, which Kemi Badenoch implemented, which is making a lot of progress.
What progress?
And I think,
for example?
Well, for example, they have actually been working with the police, with policing. They've seen the stop and search disparity between black men and white men come down from 8 times to 4 or 5 times within the space of about 2 years. So that's about a cut of a half. So that's actually huge progress in a massive area. Stop and search is something which young black men feel incredibly strongly about.
We should celebrate that we're still 4 times more likely.
That's not. I didn't say celebrate. You asked me for process. I gave you progress. I gave you an answer. But my issue with you, Kehinde, is your mantra, your idea is that you are almost a segregationist. You don't think that black people should integrate into British society. I watched you on We Are Black and British.
Well, that's quite a claim.
This is what you said on We Are Black and British. You wanted black people to be taught by black people in schools. You wanted black people to be policing each other. You didn't want integration with the rest of Britain.
Is that true? Is that what you're calling for? Are those the practical examples?
I'm calling for black independence. So, for example, I do think there is a role for black education. There has been historically in this country. It's not actually a new thing. It's not a new thing at all. It's been for a long time. And I also think that we have to have, the argument I'm making here is because we have to do, in these institutions, the way we get treated, the way we have to behave is so damaging to us that, yes, we do need our independent spaces. But I am not saying, never said, never have said, that we should all segregate ourselves and go live in different areas. I've never said that.
Stella, what's your response to what you've heard? I mean, you won't have had a chance, I don't think, to read the book. But what
I
you've
also
heard
think it's quite telling that Albie's already decided on my behalf that I'd be put off by a title. We live in a society where we recognise there is systemic racism. We've seen it in the police, we're seeing it in the NHS possibly. There are real challenges that all of us have to be part of addressing, including those of us who carry what you would call white privilege to these debates. So yes, it might make me uncomfortable to read, but it might also challenge me and make me think and help inform the work we do. And isn't that a positive and healthy thing? I mean, what are you so frightened of ideas that might challenge you?
I'm
you don't have to agree with them.
Stella.
So don't protect me, Albie. Albie, don't protect me.
I'm not protecting you.
Let me read it and learn for myself.
For you to be telling me about racism, I think is quite surprising. Look, I've been fighting the anti-racist cause within the Conservative Party for almost 3 years now. I think I've been doing quite a good job of it. I think this title is offensive to white people. And I think writing a book called The Psychosis of Whiteness
So you're concerned about white people, but you're telling me what white people think.
It's deliberately inflammatory, when actually there might be some good takeaways from the book. I mean, Catherine, what do you think about the title?
Oh, OK, so my voice doesn't count. All right.
No, Stella, your voice does count. We'll come back to you, but let's get Catherine's outcome.
I have a slightly different angle from this, and I have some quite specific concerns. So psychosis is a clinical condition where you hear auditory or have visual hallucinations. That's caused by a neurotransmitter in the brain. The idea that environment would trigger that within a certain community based on the colour of their skin makes me deeply uncomfortable. It's such a serious medical condition that the likelihood, the life expectancy of somebody with that medical condition is massively curtailed by it. And I think, frankly, for anyone that's struggling with that disease, trying to get well, it's quite offensive to suggest it's something that you can just pick up from the environment. Let me be clear, racism is bloody awful, but so is mental health issues.
100%.
And just flinging terms around like this, it really bothers me. If you see someone that has schizophrenia tomorrow and is suffering a psychotic episode, you appear to be suggesting that if they have black skin, that's not been caused by their biology, but by their environment.
So let me just firstly say this. One, it's not about individuals having psychosis. This is about saying society. It's a metaphor, right?
So which part of me is having an auditory or a visual hallucination?
This is a metaphor. So the hallucinations I argue in the book, that's the media, that's the movies, that's the film. It's a metaphor. I'm not saying that as a white person you have psychosis. This is not the argument. The argument is that the way that we understand race is completely diluted. It is supported by hallucinations in the media. And I would stress, I spoke to David Harewood on Monday, who had psychosis. So, and even psychosis and schizophrenia also, who had and did not feel traumatized. And actually understood that, yes, race did play into how his psychosis happened. And this is kind of what I'm saying. I have multiple family members who suffer from this because as a black person, you're much more likely to.
Right, well, who do you want to read Who do you want to read the book?
Anybody who's interested in having an uncomfortable conversation about race.
All right, let's go back. Let's go back to Stella. I mean, Stella, do you broadly agree with the idea that's being proposed by Kehinde that there are many white people, perhaps a lot of white people, who are deluded about issues of race or don't really have any appreciation of how bad it is?
Well, we've just had 5 minutes of trying to deconstruct the title of a book, not necessarily the content of it. So I think there is a long way to go for us to have the difficult conversations.
But it's about whether people would read it.
Ideas of privilege, of race, ethnicity, interacting with different ideas about race within it are inbuilt into our country. You know, there are conscious bias and there are unconscious bias. Words have power. They come from somewhere. I mean, Catherine, you've just done a classic example of this, of deconstructing the concept of psychosis in this debate. To denude the second word.
I'm not denuding anything. I couldn't give a sod how much melanin
Stella, go on, finish, because
they are my equal human beings.
All right, go on.
It's not about
let's finish her point.
The challenge here, Catherine, is that you and I are in a privileged position to be able to say things like that.
You don't speak for me on that. You don't put words in my mouth.
Then I think that there is a privilege in being able to decide for other people the experience that they have. And it is difficult and it is challenging, but surely if we're a society that believes in free speech, we should want to hear difficult, challenging ideas that might make us rethink some of our preconceptions about life. And you're right, none of us had the chance to read the whole book, but as Albie says, there's some really interesting stuff in there. Good research, good policy does make you uncomfortable because it makes you think. And maybe the challenge here is politicians who don't want to be made uncomfortable and think new thoughts.
Very briefly, because we haven't got long, but very briefly, Albie, and before you finish the discussion, Kehinde, very briefly, do you think this will help the discussion in terms of fighting racism?
No, I don't think this will help the discussion at all. I think it's inflammatory. I can tell that by the title. I'm sure there's some good content in the book, but unfortunately, Kehinde, you've let yourself down by trying to be as sensationalist as possible. Maybe to sell as many
very briefly, Kehinde.
All right, very briefly, this is not about white skin. It's about whiteness, and black people can equally purport the psychosis of whiteness.
So do I have white psychosis?
Which is why I'm happy you don't. All right, I am exactly what I'm saying. And the whole point is, let's have an uncomfortable conversation about race.
Well, I think we've had quite an uncomfortable conversation between us all.
We've had an uncomfortable conversation about the word psychosis, and none of us are talking about whether we've read American Psycho.
Briefly, you're going to be chair. Hang on.
That's a common
We've only got a few seconds. I just want to hear from Sarah. You're going for chair of the Standards Committee because Chris Bryant, who was here yesterday, has vacated it. We hear Harriet Harman, senior Labour MP, is also throwing her hat into the ring. You've got 10 seconds to make your pitch.
Well, look, I think Harriet would do a great job. I think what I want to do is the work on harassment. Lots of legislators around the world have had problems with harassment and bullying, but we are dragging our feet on getting it right. I think what they've done in Australia, particularly around supporting our staff, because what I'm really worried about is I don't frankly think our workplace is safe enough for our staff yet, and there's much more we can do about that. And I'd really love the opportunity to lead that work and make sure that everybody can be proud of Parliament. And
Are you going to vote for Stella?
That's not fair.
Not fair.
Yes, it is.
No,
yes, it is fair.
However, I think the staffing standards and IPSA isn't actually part of the standards committee remit,
All right.
so there may be a bit of a category error there.
All right, we've got Politics UK tomorrow and on Monday, Politics Live, 12:15. Bye-bye.
I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. I think Crescent Time's on tonight. You'll know it's on, because I'll stream it. Anyway, hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you maybe later if it's on. Ta-ra.